Today we're looking back at both the past and the future, I guess, of the Fallout franchise as we take a look at Fallout 3's Operation Anchorage. Now, I guess this is a little bit of a semi-review of our time playing it. Jill's here with me.
Hello!
But also, I wanted to kind of talk about how I think that the franchise of Fallout could actually benefit by incorporating elements of this DLC into future content expansions or story bits, because the idea of Fallout has always really been, hey, there's this really cool world, there's all kinds of lore and things that happened, from the nukes and from everything else, and also there's supernatural elements kind of hidden in the background as well. There's war, there's intrigue, but a lot of what's happening right now is because of the past. That's always been a big driver for the series, or a big point of contention, is how does the past connect with the present of the Fallout universe? And I think Operation Anchorage did a really good job of exploring this. So before we hop into it, if you want to watch more Fallout videos, we do cover this topic quite a bit. I love this series. It's actually one of my favorites. Be sure to leave a like and subscribe for more content, because going forward, we're going to be making more videos about this as well. So Jill, this was the first time you got to play Operation Anchorage, and I know you had a lot to say about it because we were kind of looking at it, and I think it's a bit of a bummer that they don't do much of this in the rest of the series. You find a lot of terminals and things like that telling you about the past, but you don't actually get to step into the past that often in the Fallout franchise, at least for very long.
Yeah, that's kind of what I wanted to talk about too, is a lot of times you're always reading about the past and imagining it, and I felt like that was more fitting back when the graphics weren't there to be able to support showing more of that stuff. But now that they are there, with Fallout 3 and then Fallout New Vegas, and obviously now even with Fallout 76 and 4, so showing what actually happened in the past is really interesting, and kind of having just your character for a little while be put back there and see what the world looked like and was like and how people acted. Because something that's really interesting in the universe, to me at least, is how corrupt the US government was, and it seems like a lot of the other governments too were, but since the game is mostly always set in the US, you mostly notice how corrupt they were in particular. And so with Operation Anchorage, when you're basically a part of the US military and you're fighting the Chinese, it's really interesting to see how they treated the military people in that.
It's also interesting to see how they talk. Everybody's an ultra-nationalist. Everything is America is the best thing ever. There's no faults. You also actually see that in something like Lonesome Road in Fallout New Vegas, where finding a lot of these past discoveries, it kind of shows that anyone who even was criticizing that system, or hey, maybe we shouldn't do things this way, they were actually labeled a communist, and it was basically treated like another Red Scare. So basically, the Cold War never ended. It just kind of switched to more of a focus of China versus America than Russia.
Yeah.
And it's interesting to me, how that all worked. And one of the cool things about Operation Anchorage is you're not actually put in exactly what happened. You were also put in a slightly unreliable narrator position, because you were put in a simulation of what the US government thought would happen.
And it was pretty accurate to what actually happened according to some of those terminals.
Yeah, in a lot of ways it was. And it's interesting to kind of see that. And I remember going into Fallout New Vegas, they had an opportunity to show you something like this again from the past when you actually get to Nellis Air Force Base and you meet the boomers. And they talk about, oh yeah, those are our VR pods. Those train us how to pilot airplanes and stuff like that. And you're like, oh cool, can I try that? And they're like, no. And it's one of those things where as a player you're thinking, okay, well, I guess they didn't want to program this in, but
they very much so should have.
This would have been really interesting, because this is very similar to what happened actually in Operation Anchorage.
Yeah.
Almost the same exact thing.
And basically our point here is they should have put that in New Vegas, and they should put it in games further down the line, because it would have been really interesting to go into a pod and see what the Air Force was like back way when, before the bombs dropped, and be able to talk to some of those people and see the planes and drive the planes. It would have been really interesting, and I think that's something that could be really interesting that they could move forward with in the series. It's even something they could add into a quest in Fallout 76 if they really wanted to.
Yeah, and what's interesting about Fallout 4 is, without really any spoilers, since it's the opening minutes of the game, you do get to see what it was like before the bombs dropped in the very opening minutes of the game.
Yeah, and that's awesome.
But after that, you don't. You know, it's after that, it's just like, oh, I remember back before the bombs dropped. And, you know, you'll have ghouls talk about it or survivors or people like that. But for the most part, you don't actually see it. I guess the closest you get to living in that world is maybe Fallout 76, because Appalachia is ravaged, but a lot of it is still fairly normal too. It's kind of a mixture. But it would be really interesting to see more of this VR stuff. And actually, I do think there's an interest in the fandom for it as well, because there's a bit of a deep cut for people who aren't interested in this, but the Creation Club for Fallout 4, these are essentially add-ons created by fans that were then vetted and endorsed by Bethesda. They are considered basically lore-friendly for the most part. Outside of the Bethesda mods, or I guess I should say Creation Club creations that add in something like the Doom Slayer's armor and stuff, the in-universe ones are pretty much seen as lore-friendly. And one of those that's very interesting is a Capital Wasteland workshop where they actually add in these VR pods. You can power them up, and then you can go in and make settlements and do creative kinds of stuff in different past settings.
And something I think would be really cool is if they did something like that in the style of Tranquility Lane, where you could go to a neighborhood and meet people, and it would be like the 1950s, or, you know, that kind of aesthetic that they're trying to go for, where, like, the women are like, oh, I baked cookies for the neighbor next door, there's nothing wrong with our life, America's great. And it's just really interesting, at least for me, to see how happy people were, even though the government was so corrupt, and how they seemed like they were excited about their lives for the most part, and then the bombs just dropped and everything got ruined.
Well, it was a dystopia that people believed was a utopia.
Yeah, and I think that's really interesting to see, and we usually only ever imagine it. And that's something I want to see more of.
Well, and there were also a lot of different layers to things going on at the time. Yes, the US government mostly had the United States under control, mostly, but there were a lot of areas where there were problems too. So, for example, you had groups trying to break away from the U.S. government and become their own entities in Appalachia, which we actually find the bunkers of those later on, the Free States. And then, of course, you also have things like where you're exploring a company, and then all of a sudden there will be this whole company was a front for a Chinese-run military operation. You find that in Fallout 3.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of intrigue and political stuff and even detective-type stories going on at the time before the bombs dropped. And how many quests do we find throughout Fallout that were directly impacted by the bombs, where it was like, hey, someone was in the middle of this thing, then the bombs went off. Now 200 years later, or however many years later, you are now finding the remnants of what they were in the middle of doing.
Yeah, and it's really interesting too, because there's been multiple times where, like, we'll read notes from people. They'll talk about, like, oh, the bombs are going off, I don't know what to do, there's sirens going on outside, and then you'll find them as a glowing one in the basement, sort of thing. And there'll be a named character and a named enemy, and it's really interesting, and then you kill them.
Yeah, pretty much. Well, and I think one of your favorites that was kind of thrown out there for you too, I know you're in the middle of a thought, but the whole Sunset Sarsaparilla one, you really liked that quest. The Legend of the Star.
I loved that, and I thought it was really interesting too with that since people didn't really understand what the whole prize was, the entire story got mixed up, and people thought that the Sunset Sarsaparilla guy who was going to give you a prize was like a real dude.
Yeah, they thought Festus was immortal.
And they thought like you were going to get something really awesome, like a bunch of caps and stuff. And nobody ever, I guess, found this facility and found the real prize, so people would kill each other over getting these stars.
Yeah.
And then when you finally do go get the prize, it's just a shitty little plastic sheriff's badge that says Sunset Sarsaparilla on it.
And they have a ton of them.
And it's just a toy for, like, it was a promotional thing back in the old world.
And there was a whole room filled with it too.
Yeah.
Because one of the dudes found it, and I feel bad for forgetting this NPC's name at that moment, but I remember he found it, and I believe he ended up killing himself. Because it was just like he had wasted his whole life and murdered so many people, and he found this prize, and it was just nothing.
Yeah, it's ridiculous and really funny to me how Fallout in general always does these big twists where, like, people will go to the extreme, like, to killing people, and then the outcome of it will be really dumb.
Yeah.
And it's really funny a lot of times when they do that.
Well, because the past was so materialistic, but nobody needed material things really to survive.
Mm-hmm.
You know, like they had everything they needed. They had robot servants. They had more food than they could possibly want.
Mm-hmm.
Security. So it's now when you're in a world of people who don't have that, they can't understand that the world used to be that way. You know, they weren't raised in it. Life's never been that way for them.
Mm-hmm.
So to them, it's like, oh, this prize from the old world, it must be some kind of technology that is surviving that will make my life better for the rest of what I have to live in this hellscape.
Mm-hmm.
And then they get to it and they find nothing. And one thing I think would be really cool to see more of these simulations and more of these past events and be able to play some of them. Now, we don't want a full game of it. You know, like we don't want a full game, but I think it would help flesh out this world so you can see what it was like.
And I still like the subtlety and the detective work of going into some places and like having to read and find things to find out what happened. So, like, we don't need a simulation every single time.
Right, you don't need something like, okay, well, you reached this location, but what was it like 200? You don't need that.
No, but it would be fun to see that sometimes. And also, speaking of the robots, like you said, something that I thought was really interesting is there's most likely a lot of technology that just didn't survive the bombs at all, that nobody was able to fix.
Mm-hmm.
And if you have simulations from back then, we would be able to see more of what the technology was like back then, and they were a really advanced society with that.
Mm-hmm.
And that's something that I was really interested in.
Well, it's something too that you kind of, I think a big missed opportunity is cars.
Mm-hmm.
Now, you don't necessarily need cars in the modern Fallout, and more than enough people have modded them in, but to be able to walk into a city and see, well, how did this operate? How was traffic? Something as stupid as that.
Mm-hmm.
What was going on with these cars, and what was it like? Because you find these burned out husks all the time,
Mm-hmm.
but you don't actually get to see them in use.
Yeah.
So that kind of stuff, I think those elements of the past, I actually think it would do a lot to show you what was lost
Mm-hmm.
and what it actually means that the world is now so messed up.
Yeah, and I think that it will impact people a little bit more to be like, you know, here's this dystopian but also kind of utopian place where people were mostly happy, and then it just is all gone now.
Yeah.
And how that makes you feel. Because a lot of times when you play these types of games, you think to yourself, well, what would have I been like in this situation if I actually had bombs drop on my house? And I think that's pretty impactful to people.
Well, and one of the things I love about Operation Anchorage is that it does just that. Yes, you're not in a city, you're not in the most populated place ever, but you're in Alaska, you're going around, you're essentially fighting this war, and like we said, it's ultra-nationalistic and very straightforward. It's not the deepest DLC, nor is it at all the best Fallout DLC.
But I thought it was really interesting.
That's the thing, is the heart of the idea was there to make something really, really cool, and I just don't think we've seen it since then, because also the idea too that this would give you access at times to more technology even in the present of the Fallout universe. For example, working with the outcasts and unlocking technology that you wouldn't have been able to get otherwise in that bunker.
Yeah, like that Chinese stealth suit.
Or even being able to find that power armor that you're not able to get otherwise, the winterized power armor.
Mm-hmm.
It makes the world feel more connected because not only do you get to see something from back then, but now you get to experience it in the modern day too.
It makes that whole like simulation feel like it paid off. You know, that all of the stuff that you did in it actually mattered to your actual game file. Instead of just doing it and then being like, okay, well, I didn't get anything out of this for my actual save file in the present, so like, why not even bother? You know, something I really liked about the DLC in particular, too, is a lot of the strategy that had to go through it, because they taught you some things that you did differently in that DLC with fighting than you would in the actual, you know, real world. And it's really interesting because the Chinese were doing things like trying to make these weapons and such like that, and you kind of had to go around blowing them up. And then there was, at one point, a field full of electricity that you had to just turn off to be able to go through. And I thought it was really cool and really interesting that there was some different things that went along with the technology that you had to do that you wouldn't normally do in the real world.
Yeah, you wouldn't normally encounter an obstacle that would be designed to shut down an army of power armor, because there's not actually that many people using power armor in modern Fallout.
And it made the DLC feel a little bit more difficult, too, because it actually seemed like the other people there were more on your level, whereas a lot of times when you're just playing normal Fallout, it kind of feels like you're a god and everybody else doesn't know what they're doing.
Well, I think the idea to not rely on stim packs, you know, like you pointed out to me, going for those health stations instead of stim packs, it could be annoying, but it was something that fundamentally set the gameplay apart from the rest of the game.
Yeah, because that's something that they probably did back then. Because I bet they probably just didn't want to have a ton of stim packs carrying around on the military people because they couldn't carry around big backpacks.
Right.
They had to carry what they picked up.
Well, it was kind of teaching soldiers to be resourceful, too.
Yes, yeah.
Anyways, this was a look back at the past and the hopeful future of Fallout. There's so much in these games that's really, really creative and awesome. It's why it's one of our favorite franchises. I know the Fallout games are not perfect. I know they have those Bethesda bugs and issues, and
I think that gives them charm, though, and I think the amount of lore that they have in them, it could make me think about and talk about it for hours on end.
yeah.
And that's something I really like about video games.
I love that about them, and I love that about the Elder Scrolls games, too.